How will Asia confound the 2026 World Cup favorites? Are you interested in surprises from Asia? What tactics will Japan, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia employ? Find out in this video. Asian teams are about to embrace rotations, systematic, well-timed positional changes that upend compact defenses. Expect coordinated movements where the fullback drops into midfield, the winger shifts into the half space, and the striker drops back to lure the center back out of position, all within 2 or 3 passes. This isn't theory, it's a pattern that can be observed and predicted. Here's how rotations work on the field. One player intentionally leaves the area, the defensive midfielder drops back, the striker moves, a teammate immediately moves into the vacated space, and a third player makes a vertical or diagonal dash into the new space. Execution matters. 2-touch passes, angled first touches towards the next lane, and timing runs to the passer's shoulder are specific actions that create numerical superiority and force defenders into poor choices. Look for the signals that trigger the press: the ball carrier's head raised, a midfielder's half turn, or a pressed wide player playing a short pass inside, and you'll see the sequence unfold. Why this will puzzle the favorites. Many elite teams rely on fixed fullbacks and predictable pressing signals. In Asian teams, the rotation changes. Who marks whom in each possession, turning 1v1 situations into 3v2 in zones, and opening up lanes for low crosses or quick vertical passes. Watch for fullbacks playing in reverse to become playmakers, center backs dropping into midfield to initiate attacks, and fullbacks finishing low crosses. Watch this video, and you'll be able to name the rotation, identify the signal, and anticipate the next rush. Tools that turn understanding into a real advantage when the favorites start to fuss. 1. European giants are preparing to dominate the 2026 World Cup. Top European teams arrive with deep squads and explicit rotation doctrines designed to preserve elite legs and maintain tactical unpredictability. They build match plans that assume multiple personnel permutations. The starting 11 is a base model, not a fixed blueprint. Key players such as world-class wingers, box-to-box midfielders, and ball-playing center backs are used in modular roles so coaches can swap combinations without changing the overall system. Squad depth is a tool for managing fixture congestion, injury risk, and opponent-specific challenges. Rotations fall into 2 clear categories: in-game positional rotations and squad rotations across matches. Positional rotations are pre-rehearsed movements, center backs stepping into midfield, wingers inverting into half spaces, fullbacks overlapping into channels to create overloads or to escape a press. Squad rotations are managed substitutions and selection changes between fixtures to preserve intensity over the tournament. Both types have distinct triggers. A high press from the opponent triggers inward rotations and short passing sequences. A compact low block triggers shifting wide and introducing pace through substituted wingers. Coaches link theory to execution with precise, repeatable sequences. For example, when the opponent presses the goalkeeper and first line, the right center back receives and rotates into the midfield half space, the execution step. The right fullback advances to form a 3-man midfield by occupying the half space vacated by the center back, and the inverted winger drops to open the flank for the overlapping fullback, the tactical intention. Training rehearses that sequence in 7v7 pressing drills, using shadow defenders to simulate triggers and timed cues to practice the exact moment of rotation. Short, focused sessions isolate each swap: center back to midfield rotations on Monday, winger to midfield inversions on Tuesday, and longer, match-like rehearsals integrate them. Selection rotations are equally methodical. Staff use GPS load data, recovery metrics, and opponent scouting to decide who rests and when. A central striker known for hold-up play may start against a deep defensive side to create chances. A pacey substitute is planned for the 60-75-minute window when defenders typically fatigue, creating a clear substitution plan rather than an anno domini hoc change. Teams will often rotate fullbacks more frequently because of cumulative sprint volume. That is execution. Concrete substitution windows tied to measurable player loads and tactical objectives, not philosophical talking points. Tactical tendencies among the top nations illustrate practical rotation choices. Teams that favor possession rotate former wide forwards into central zones to overload midfield and free fullbacks to advance. This forces opponents to choose which threat to close down and opens lanes for diagonals behind the defense. Sides that rely on quick transitions rotate between a physical defensive pivot and a more creative deep-lying distributor, depending on the opponent's pressing intensity. In practice, this means a coach might start with a hard-working 6 to neutralize a rival's press, and then switch to a creative 6 when the opponent substitutes out their energetic presser. Matchday micro-rotations and set-piece rotations provide additional edges. Coaches rehearse substitution scenarios linked to specific game states, down by a goal, up by a goal, or tied and desperate for control, so replacements are immediately effective. Set-piece rotations vary corner takers and runner assignments to avoid predictability. Penalty order is a planned list rather than an on-the-spot decision. Communication is standardized. A single word or signal indicates the type of rotation the team will execute so that players move in unison. When executed precisely, these pragmatic rotations conserve energy, exploit opponent weaknesses, and maintain the high-tempo European giants expect to impose. 2. What surprises Japan, Korea, Saudi Arabia, and other Asian teams will bring, and why they could become the main killers of the top teams. Japan and South Korea now field squads with a high proportion of Europe-based players and coaching staff who prioritize pressing intensity and positional fluidity, and that has translated into concrete tactical recipes rather than abstract ideas. Saudi Arabia's domestic league investment has lifted technical and physical standards, producing players who can execute fast transitional patterns and contest physically at the highest level. Other Asian teams such as Iran, Australia, and Qatar combine disciplined defensive blocks with rehearsed set-piece and counter templates that are easy to implement under tournament pressure. These are factual building blocks that explain how surprises are not accidental but engineered. Rotations will be one of the clearest weapons. For Japan, expect a common sequence. A central pivot drops toward the center backs to create a 3-2 build-up on the flank. The narrow winger inverts into the half space. The outside fullback overlaps into the vacated channel to receive a penetrating crossfield pass. Quick. That rotation forces the opponent to make choice-based defending, step out and leave a lane behind, or hold shape and concede a local 2v1. Korea uses a related but more direct version. A deep-lying midfielder rotates wide to press the opponent's advancing fullback, while the forward drops to pull central defenders out, opening space for overlapping wingbacks to sprint into behind the line. Executed repeatedly at match tempo, the pattern becomes predictable to the attacking team, but almost impossible for tired opponents to contain. Sequence-level triggers are practiced to the point of muscle memory. When a top team tries to play out under pressure, Asian teams will train specific pressing triggers, a certain body orientation from the central defender, a pass to the weaker-footed fullback, or a back pass with too much weight. The first trigger brings the winger in tight. The second activates the mid to step into the passing lane. The third brings a central striker to block the exit. Short passes, then a quick vertical through ball. Over and over. This is not theory. It is a coaching plan for who presses when, who covers the space vacated, and who must exploit the turnover immediately. Set-piece craft and transitional routes also make them dangerous. Rather than relying only on long balls, teams like Iran and Saudi Arabia have drilled short corner routines, decoy near-post runs and blindside screens to generate clean headers or cutbacks. Japan's technical players can execute low-driven in-swingers and rehearsed second-ball sequences that punish zonal marking lapses. Korea will often combine a tall central defender's aerial presence at the far post with a late-arriving midfielder into the box. It's simple, but it wins matches when favorites underestimate the timing and physicality. Goalkeeper distribution is part of the plan too. Quick throws or one-touch outlets from the keeper start counters before the opponent's midfield can organize. Bench management and rotation during games are decisive and clearly mapped out. Coaches will plan for two distinct phases. An initial high-intensity pressing block maintained for 60-70 minutes. Then a rotation that brings on fresh legs who continue the pressure but with different movement profiles. Shift from a narrow press to zonal mid-block, or introduce a target runner to stretch the backline. Substitutions are not Anno Domini Hoc. They are scheduled swaps that change how space is used. Swap an inside forward for a speed-based winger to exploit fatigued center backs, or replace a central midfielder with a more defensive pivot to invite pressure and spring counters. Those choices, when executed crisply, convert tactical intent into goals against superior opposition. Finally, preparation and opponent-specific tweaks convert these patterns into killer moments. Asian coaches will study opponent tendencies, which side drifts forward, which center back prefers to turn on the ball, and then tailor their rotations to attack those weaknesses. For example, if a favorite habitually leaves a single pivot exposed when their fullback advances, a team will rotate a forward into that channel to create a 2 versus 1. If an opponent struggles with long diagonal switches, Japan or Korea will press centrally to force errors and then immediately attempt the long diagonal into a sprinting fullback. Tactical clarity, rehearsed rotations, situational substitutions, and set-piece precision together explain why these teams can upset and even eliminate top-ranked opponents. 3. High pressing, hybrid formations, and a crazy tempo that the favorites from Europe and South America are not prepared for. Several Asian teams now combine sustained high pressing with fluid, hybrid formations that regularly flip shape between defensive and attacking phases. A common practical pattern is the nominal back 3 that becomes a back 4 when a wing-back drops, or a 4-2-3-1 that shifts into a narrow 3-4-3 in possession as an inverted winger moves inside and a fullback pushes up. These are not abstract statements. The utility is concrete. By changing angles and overloads, teams create both pressing traps off the ball and extra passing lanes on the ball, forcing opponents to navigate unfamiliar spatial relationships at a very fast pace. Pressing is choreographed around triggers and channel control rather than random sprinting. Typical triggers include a back pass to a center back, a heavy first touch by a deep-lying midfielder, or the goalkeeper picking up the ball. When a trigger appears, the nearest forward initiates the first engagement, the inside winger squeezes the passing lane, and a supporting midfielder shifts to cut the diagonal pass. Practically, that looks like two attackers closing the ball-side center back to deny a safe short pass, while a third attacker screens the vertical pass into midfield. Defenders are forced wide into predictable channels, where the team has planted a numerical or positional funnel to win the ball high up the pitch. Rotations are explicit and rehearsed, not improvisational. In possession, a wing-back will rotate with an advanced wide midfielder. The wing-back pushes high and wide to stretch the opponent. Then the winger tucks inside to occupy a half space and create a vertical passing lane. Out of possession, the sequence reverses, with the inside winger stepping out to mark the opposition fullback and the wing-back dropping into a back 5. Midfield pivots rotate to cover vacated spaces. When the right-sided pivot presses upward to support a counterpress, the left pivot drifts laterally to offer a pass and shield the backline. Coaches drill these exchanges so that each movement has a designated cover. The covering player angles body position to block the most dangerous pass rather than chasing the ball directly. Execution relies on brief, high-intensity waves and immediate recovery. Tempo is a tactical tool. Teams will apply intense collective pressure for a short, sustained burst to force an error, then quickly transition into sustained high-possession phases to exploit the turnover. That tempo is maintained by planned physical rotations. A striker may press in short full-gas intervals, while a supporting forward shades off to patrol channels, and halftime or bench rotations are used to replenish players who have completed multiple pressing cycles. On the pitch, this appears as rapid 1-2 passing to break the first line of pressure, immediately followed by coordinated sprints to exploit the open space, quick-footed combinations in tight areas, then explosive vertical runs to finish the sequence. To make the approach work against technically adept European or South American teams, Asian sides link scouting analysis to the mechanics of pressing and rotation. They target specific tendencies, for example, a center back who favors the long diagonal or a defensive midfielder who habitually checks short to his left, and assign a rotation pattern to trap that tendency. The nearest forward delays while an adjacent midfielder angles off, creating a two-layer pressure that funnels the ball into a pre-designated pocket. The result is a living system, clear roles, rehearsed rotations, and a relentless tempo that turns theoretical pressing concepts into repeatable, match-ready execution. 4. How Asian teams are breaking the traditional 4-3-3 and 4-2-3-1 formations by overloading the flanks and clever positional football. Teams from Asia are increasingly rejecting static 4-3-3 or 4-2-3-1 silhouettes in favor of a fluid, flank-focused game that trades a rigid shape for coordinated overloads. Coaches instruct one wide attacker to tuck into the half space, while the opposite fullback pushes high and wide. This simple swap immediately creates a 3v2 on the touchline when the opponent maintains a narrow defensive block. The overload is not accidental, but rehearsed. The inside forward's diagonal drift drags a central defender out of position. The fullback times the overlap to the first touch, and a Metsala or deep-lying playmaker carries through the vacated corridor to combine. Short passes and quick 1-2s are used to exploit the resulting mismatch before the defensive line can slide over. Rotations are mapped like choreography, and teams practice specific sequences until they become instinctive. Example rotation. Possession starts with a center back. He passes to the pivot who can either step forward or shift wide. If the pivot receives and moves into the half space, the nearest winger tucks inside toward the penalty arc. The fullback on that side sprints beyond him, and a forward from the opposite flank makes a diagonal run behind the defense. That sequence produces clear execution options: a driven cross from the overlap, a cutback into the arriving Metsala, or a through ball into the channel for the opposite forward. Coaches rehearse the timing so the fullback's high run coincides with the winger's internal movement. The three elements must happen within 2 or 3 passes for the overload to be decisive. On the receiving end of pressure, these teams maintain balance through pre-assigned covering roles rather than anno domini hoc recovery. When a fullback advances, the nearest central midfielder narrows to cover the flank and prevent counterattacks. If the ball is lost, the inside forward who had tucked in immediately presses the opposing midfielder to delay the transition, while a staggered center back steps up to block the central passing lane. Those defensive rotations, fullback forward, midfielder cover, inside forward press, are drilled as a unit so recovery is fast and predictable. The result: sustained attacking width without leaving the center exposed for long periods. Execution relies on clear triggers rather than abstract principles. Triggers can be a pivot receiving on the half turn, a winger cutting inside beyond a certain touchline threshold, or a defender's pass angled toward the corner flag. Once the trigger happens, predefined actions follow. First man carries, second man supports, third man offers a penetrating option. In practice, this looks like a 2-pass overload that finishes with a low cross or a driven diagonal ball. Defensively, it looks like a midfielder sliding to the outside, while another midfielder occupies the space the defender vacated. Teams communicate these rotations with small cues, body shape, verbal shouts, or eye contact, and the fluidity comes from repetition rather than improvisation. Coaches also vary which flank they overload to keep opponents guessing. Instead of consistently attacking one side, they alternate the overload after just a few possessions, forcing the opposing fullback and winger to chase laterally and tiring them out. When opponents double up on a flagged overload, the attacking team quickly switches play to the opposite flank where the same rotation can be executed with the fresh advantage of space. This interplay between half-space occupation, overlapping fullbacks, and midfield covering rotations gives Asian teams a reliable method to dismantle compact defenses while retaining defensive integrity when possession is lost. 5. Why Japan and Korea are becoming tactical laboratories, not just underdogs. Both countries have reoriented their talent pipelines and coaching structures towards systematic tactical experimentation, and that shows up on the field in measurable ways. Youth academies in Japan and South Korea prioritize decision-making under pressure and positional versatility, which produces players comfortable rotating through several roles in a single sequence. They also send more young players to Europe and to diverse tactical environments, returning with experiential knowledge that coaches integrate into national training sessions. The result is not scattershot experimentation, but an applied lab where small variations in structure are rehearsed and refined. Rotations are a central tool in those experiments, and they are taught with precise triggers and responsibilities rather than left to improvisation. For example, a common Japanese sequence begins with a defensive midfielder, DM, stepping into the half space as a build-up fulcrum, the right winger, RW, inverting into a central pocket, and the right fullback, RB, overlapping into the vacated wide lane. Short. The timing is explicit. The DM carries forward only when the opposing pivot is ball side. The inverter moves inside on the first pass off the center backs, and the fullback accelerates into the outside channel on the third touch. Coaches drill the passing angles, the third man run, and the recovery responsibilities until the rotation becomes a rehearsed micro-attack rather than a spontaneous gamble. Korea applies the same principle, but often with different role sets and tempo. A typical Korean rotation uses a double pivot where one holding midfielder steps wide to create a staggered three-man line with the two center backs, allowing a winger to cut inside and a wingback to sprint into the vacant flank. Then the attacking midfielder, AM, either occupies the freed half space or makes the angled run behind the dropper. Short. Execution hinges on who covers the space left by the stepping midfielder. One center back must drift wide while the opposite midfielder screens the channel. Practically, teams rehearse this through pattern play and constrained possession drills that force the pivot to make split-second decisions under pressure. Training links theory directly to execution through rehearsed game models and objective feedback loops. Coaches use small-sided games with defined roles, 7v7+3 with designated droppers, for example, to create the exact rotation scenario and increase repetition. Video sessions isolate the 3-second window that determines success, where the ball must go, who must follow, and who must cover. Short. GPS and event data help measure whether the fullback reached the overlap in time, whether the inverter received the ball facing forward, and how many seconds the opposing defense took to regain shape. Those metrics inform the next microcycle of training. Defensively, rotations force opponents into uncomfortable choices, and both nations practice the counter-rotations that exploit these reactions. When a winger inverts and a fullback overlaps, defenders face a choice: press the ball and surrender an outside channel, or hold shape and invite a penetrating pass into the half space. Japan and Korea prepare specific counteranswers, such as the defensive mid dropping to create a passive press, while an auxiliary center back fills the lateral void. Short. Coaches rehearse recovery runs, half-space blocking, and forward-pressing triggers so that the attacking rotation doesn't simply become a predictable pattern to be punished. Finally, the lab mentality extends to match management and substitution patterns that amplify rotational systems in-game. Substitutes are chosen not only for fresh legs, but for who can slot into a rotation without breaking the pattern. An attacking sub might be told to invert immediately, while a wingback's instruction is to hug the touchline for the first 5 minutes to re-establish the overlap rhythm. These are small, concrete instructions that connect abstract tactical ideas to a player's first touch and first movement after entering the pitch. Short. As favorites analyze a starting 11, they increasingly face multi-layered rotations practiced to the point of habit, which is why these teams have shifted from unpredictable underdogs to deliberate tactical laboratories. 6. In which 2026 World Cup matches could Asian teams pull off the tournament's biggest upsets? Several Asian sides enter the tournament with the athletic profile and tactical flexibility that make specific matchups ripe for shocks. Japan and South Korea in particular bring quick ball circulation, disciplined pressing triggers, and forwards who can exploit narrow spaces. Those traits are deadly against possession-heavy Europeans that leave channels open when reorganizing. Against teams like Spain or France, an Asian side that times its pressing rotations and transitions can turn possession into high-quality chances within 3 passes. When Japan faces a creative possession team, the practical execution is straightforward. Defend compact in a 4-4-2 or 4-2-3-1 block, then rotate midfielders vertically on turnovers so the ball immediately hits the wide attacker. Rotate means this: the number 10 drops to draw the defensive pivot, a winger inverts into the half space, and a fullback overlaps into the vacated channel. If Kubo or Mitoma receive in that half space, they have a one-on-one opportunity. If they don't, the coach brings on a fresh wide runner around the 60, 70-minute mark to exploit tiring fullbacks. That's substitution pattern, a pace injection from the bench timed after sustained possession by the opponent. is a repeatable path to an upset. South Korea's best upset chances come in single elimination ties against top-tier defenders who sit deep. Son Heung-min's movement off the last defender creates vertical lanes. To unlock these lanes, South Korea should employ tight rotational sequences among its midfield three. An initial forward press forces a clearance, the central pivot steps into the space, and a winger immediately switches flanks to stretch the backline. Coaches will often substitute a high-energy press forward at roughly the hour to maintain intensity. That clear substitution plan combats fatigue and keeps counterattacks potent. Against teams like Germany or England, the practical focus is on timing. Start with intensity, then rotate to a conservative block, and use two late attacking substitutions to punish gaps. Iran and Saudi Arabia will target set pieces and transition counters in matches versus technically superior opponents, such as Portugal or the Netherlands. Execution here is measurable. Rehearsed corner routines that use short corners to create mismatches, combined with center-forward rotations where one striker peels to the near post while another occupies the central defender, forcing switching errors. Coaches should preset substitution roles, a tall target for the last 20 minutes if chasing, or a mobile forward to run in behind if defending. So every rotation, whether positional in open play or personnel on the bench, has a clear objective. Australia's upset blueprint centers on wingback rotations and aerial dominance. Against teams that concede set-piece height, Australia should rotate their wide players between touchline hugging and inverted positions during a single possession to drag fullbacks out of shape. Practically, that means training sequences where the left wingback alternates overlap with cross and inside combination roles in successive phases, confusing man-marking responsibilities. Substitutions are then used not philosophically but functionally. Replace the wingback at the first sign of fatigue, keeping the overload threat fresh late in the match. Qatar and other emerging AFC teams can surprise in group stage fixtures if they force a compact opponent to overcommit. The clear plan here is to rotate possession through tight triangles until a fullback advances, then immediately switch play to the opposite flank. Success depends on pacing rotations. Coaches should schedule short, frequent in-game rotations of midfield personnel to maintain pressing intensity, rather than a single wholesale switch that disrupts structure. In short, the Asian upsets most likely come from matches where the underdog executes disciplined defensive rotations, times attacking substitutions to exploit late-game fatigue, and uses in-possession positional rotations to create overloads. When those concrete actions, specific role swaps, planned substitution windows, and practice set-piece routines, are tied to scouting reports on an opponent's vulnerabilities, an upset ceases to be a fluke and becomes a repeatable tactical outcome. 7. Why are the favorites suddenly struggling against unexpected Asian opponents? Asian teams keep producing profiles that differ from the steady templates many favorites prepare for, and that difference is measurable on the pitch. Japan's wins over established European sides, Saudi Arabia's shock result against a top CONMEBOL team, and South Korea's successes in knockout environments are examples that exposed a pattern. Disciplined collective rotation, high tempo on short sequences, and frequently shifting player roles that unsettle scouting reports. Teams that expected predictable positional maps instead encountered interchanges between wingbacks, inverted fullbacks, and midfielders who alternate between holding and creative roles within the same phase of play. The result is more space created for quick vertical passes and fewer reliable cues for pressing or offside traps. Rotations in these matches are not random improvisation. They follow clear, repeatable principles that coaches drill. Positional rotation means players literally swap roles mid-phase. For example, a defensive midfielder drops between the center backs to form a back three, while a full-back pushes higher into midfield. Lateral rotation happens when a winger inverts inside, and the overlapping full-back carries width, creating a new passing lane on the flank. Vertical rotation is the classic striker dropping to pull a center back out, allowing a late-arriving midfielder to exploit the half space. Pressing rotation shifts responsibilities. One forward engages the ball carrier while a nearby midfielder rotates up to cover the passing lane, and a deeper midfielder lifts to close the channel behind. Each rotation has a trigger, possession changes, the opponent's body shape, or a pre-planned third-man run. So execution depends on timing and recognition as much as on movement itself. Linking theory to execution requires breaking down actual sequence work. Take a sequence many favorites misread. The pivot drops. Center back steps wide to cover him. The nominal right back pushes into midfield, and a winger receives a quick 1-2 with the rotated midfielder before a diagonal switch to the opposite flank. In practice, this is trained with pattern play drills that start from the goalkeeper and force 3-second actions. Goalkeeper plays to pivot. Pivot lays off to inverted fullback. Inverted fullback plays a first-time vertical to the winger. Coaches practice the rotation until the receiving player's timing and the supporting run become automatic. On the training ground, coaches use constrained rondos to reproduce the spatial pressure and small-sided games with designated rotation roles to build muscle memory. Visual cues, shoulder checks, hand gestures, and verbal calls are rehearsed so the pattern emerges under match fatigue. Favorites often struggle because their scouting models focus on static heat maps and single formation labels, while the Asian opponents rely on role fluidity that breaks those models. When center backs are coached to step for an offside trap, a striker who drops and a wingback who inverts within the same movement removes the safety net. The trap is sprung in the wrong moment. Physical conditioning compounds this. Sustained high-tempo rotations force repeated accelerations and change of direction, and that wears down defenders' timing for coordinated steps. Add in rapid transitions, 2 or 3 passes after recovery that exploit the newly created half space, and the usual markers defenders use to delay passes are gone. The favorite's tendency to react rather than preempt, trusting video scouting of isolated matches, leaves them vulnerable to patterns they haven't drilled against. Practical adjustments that work are concrete and executable. Scouts should catalog rotation patterns rather than just formations. Who drops, who inverts, and what the trigger is. Defending teams need rehearsed counter-rotations. For example, assign a drop perimeter rule where a designated central midfielder must hold to prevent the late run into the half space when a striker vacates. Center backs should train delay techniques, staying compact and forcing a sideways pass rather than stepping for an offside trap at the first sign of motion. Defenders must also practice covering rotations with clear communication protocols, single-word calls, hold, rotate, pick, and eye-line checks at restart situations. Substitution rotations are equally important. Coach-planned windows to introduce fresh, role-specific players can blunt the opponent's tempo. When favorites translate these theoretical countermeasures into drills, simulated rotations, situational 11v11 with prescribed role swaps, and conditioned recovery sprints, the gap narrows and the so-called unexpected becomes manageable. Brief overview. At the 2026 World Cup, Asian teams will win matches through dynamic rotations, the inclusion of fullbacks and inverted wingers, coordinated pressing, and a specialization in set pieces, all based on fast vertical execution rather than slow possession. Rotations are literally movement patterns. A holding midfielder drops into the defensive line, an attacking midfielder moves into the half space, a winger moves inside, and a fullback times his run into the vacated space. In practice, this looks like a 1-2 sequence: drop, move, run, culminating in a penetrating pass to a late central midfielder for a shot or back pass. This sequence explains how space is created and exploited, not just a tactical term. When watching highlights, pay attention to the triggers. Which player drops to provoke a press, who moves wide to distract the center back, and how the fullback's run splits the defense. You'll start to notice the same rotations over and over again, and see how small, temporary clashes, a one-touch pass, a half-second pause on the run, turn theory into goals. If this analysis has helped you look at football tactics differently, please like and subscribe to stay up to date with similar tactical analysis. Tell us in the comments which Asian team you expect to see some amazing matches from. Stay tuned. The favorites are in for tactical surprises.